Hands up! There's a man trespassing on our property! Arrest him! The shrill voice cut through the quiet night like a shard of glass. I'm a combat engineer, recently retired, and this was supposed to be my first night of peace in a cabin I'd inherited. But outside my door stood an HOA Karen, flanked by two goons in cheap security uniforms, acting like a SWAT team for the suburbs. She was pointing at me, screaming that my family's land was hers. The injustice of it all was breathtaking. She had no idea who she was messing with, and she'd made a critical error. She'd underestimated my dogs. This whole crazy story is about what happens when you push a quiet man too far. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because you won't believe how this ends. My first day at my grandfather's cabin was supposed to be a decompression, a long-awaited exhale after 30 years of service. The place was more memory than structure, a collection of timbers and fieldstone perched on the shore of Whisper Lake, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. It was rustic, unpretentious, and most importantly, it was mine. It had been in my family for 80 years, long before the surrounding development, Whispering Pines Estates, had even been a gleam in a developer's eye. The air was clean, the silence was profound, broken only by the lapping of water against the shore and the rustle of leaves. My two partners in this new life of tranquility, Thor and Loki, were exploring every scent with the intense focus only a Belgian Malinois can muster. They were more than pets. They were my former colleagues, trained in protection, masters of controlled chaos, yet gentle giants with me. Watching them trot through the woods, I felt a knot in my chest I didn't know I'd been carrying finally begin to loosen. The day was spent in a satisfying rhythm of physical labor, unpacking boxes, checking the old generator, clearing leaves from the gutters. As dusk settled, painting the lake in hues of orange and purple, I sat on the old wooden porch, a lukewarm beer in my hand, Thor's head resting on my knee. This was it. This was the peace I had worked for, the quiet I had earned. The illusion of that peace was shattered at precisely 10:47 p.m. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was a violent, percussive banging on the heavy oak door that made the whole cabin vibrate. Thor and Loki were on their feet in a silent instant, muscles coiled, positioned between me and the door without a single command. I peered through the small curtained window next to the door. Bathed in the cold, aggressive glare of several high-powered flashlights were three figures. The one in the center was a woman who practically radiated entitlement. She was clad in what looked like ridiculously expensive silk loungewear, a stark white against the darkness, her face a mask of pinched fury. Flanking her were two large men poured into ill-fitting black uniforms with a tacky, Whispering Pines security patch stitched on the arm. They looked less like professional security and more like bouncers from a rundown nightclub. I cracked the door open a few inches, keeping the chain lock engaged. Before I could speak, the woman unleashed a torrent of accusations. "You are trespassing on private HOA property," she shrieked, her voice a weaponized whine. "I am Carol Miller, president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, and I am ordering you to vacate these premises immediately." I could hear the low guttural growl vibrating from Thor's chest beside me. "Ma'am," I started, keeping my voice level, "I think there's been a mistake. This is my property." "It's been in my family for..." She cut me off with a derisive laugh. "A mistake? The only mistake was you thinking you could squat here. This cabin and its lake access are assets of the association. We have the deed." I sighed. This was a battle my grandfather had mentioned, a nuisance he'd swatted away for years. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're mistaken. I have the deed right here. My property is not, and never has been, part of your HOA." I held up a clear, plastic-sleeved copy of the notarized document, pointing to the parcel number and the official county seal visible through the window. She squinted at it, then sneered. "A forgery. Pathetic. We know all about you people trying to cheat your way into our community." This was delusion on a level I hadn't encountered outside a war zone. Her two goons, who had been shifting their weight like impatient bulls, took a step forward. "Carol, you want us to handle this?" one of them grunted, placing a meaty hand on the door. Carol gave a sharp, imperious nod. Remove him. The property needs to be secured. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a dispute. This was a home invasion. I am telling you to get off my property, I said, my voice dropping into a register I hadn't used in years. You are not law enforcement, and you are about to break the law. The man with his hand on the door just smirked. We're security. We're the law here. In that split second, I saw his shoulder dip. I knew what was coming. I had a half-second to prepare for the inevitable. The old wood of the door frame protested with a sickening crack, and then exploded inward. The chain snapped, and the door flew open, slamming against the interior wall. The two men stumbled into the cabin, their momentum carrying them forward, their eyes wide with aggression. But what they hadn't accounted for, what the imperious Carol standing on my porch couldn't see, were the two silent shadows that had been waiting. They were met not by a single retired engineer, but by 160 pounds of focused, protective fury. Thor and Loki didn't bark. They didn't need to. In the chaotic moment of the break-in, a lifetime of training took over. Before the intruders could even fully register the presence of the dogs, I gave the one-word release command, a word I prayed I'd never have to use in this new, quiet life. Watch. It wasn't a command to maul or to kill. It was a command to neutralize a threat, a specific protocol they had drilled hundreds of times. The larger goon, the one who'd broken the door, was the first target. Loki launched himself, a streamlined missile of muscle, clamping down on the man's forearm with the force of a hydraulic press. It was a perfect bite and hold, designed to incapacitate. The man let out a strangled scream of pain and shock, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The second goon, seeing his partner engaged, raised a heavy-looking flashlight like a club. He never got the chance to swing it. Thor, moving with blurring speed, executed a low takedown, seizing his ankle and pulling his feet out from under him. The man went down hard, his head hitting the corner of a wooden crate with a hollow thud. The cabin, my sanctuary, was a scene of pandemonium. Carol was on the porch, her mouth a perfect O of horror, a high-pitched, continuous shriek escaping her. Inside, the first goon was trying to beat Loki off his arm with his free hand, his cries now guttural and panicked. I immediately issued the recall command. Heal! Thor and Loki disengaged instantly. Their obedience was absolute. They released their holds and were back at my side in a heartbeat, panting slightly, eyes locked on the intruders, ready for the next command. The silence that followed was broken only by the whimpering of the man on the floor, and Carol's hysterical screaming outside. The man with the bite wound was clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. His partner was dazed, trying to sit up. The smell of fear and adrenaline was thick in the air. My door was splintered, my peace was shattered, and there were two injured men in my living room. I pulled out my phone, my hand steady despite the surge of adrenaline, and dialed 911. Yes, I said, my voice a mask of calm. I need to report a home invasion at 112 Whisper Lake Road. The intruders have been neutralized by my security animals. Please send police and an ambulance. I looked past the bleeding goons to the screaming woman on my porch. She had started this suburban war. I was going to finish it. The flashing red and blue light sliced through the dense woods, turning my tranquil retreat into a crime scene. 2 county sheriff's deputies and a pair of paramedics arrived to a scene of utter confusion. On the porch, Carol was a whirlwind of hysteria, her silk pajamas now rumpled and stained with dirt from where she'd apparently collapsed in a fit of manufactured drama. He's a monster! He tried to kill us, she shrieked at the deputies, pointing a trembling finger at me. His dogs are vicious. They're killers. He's an illegal squatter. Inside my cabin, the 2 security goons were being tended to by paramedics. One, whose name I'd later learn was Chad, had a deep set of puncture wounds in his forearm that was being bandaged under pressure. The other, a lunkhead named Gary, had a nasty goose egg on his head and a sprained ankle. They were both moaning, playing their injuries up for all they were worth. Amidst this chaos, I was the picture of calm. When the senior deputy, a man with a tired face and eyes that had seen everything, approached me, I simply stood my ground. Thor and Loki sitting perfectly at my sides. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" he asked, his hand resting warily on his sidearm. I didn't get defensive. I just presented the facts. "Certainly, officer." At approximately 10:47 p.m., these three individuals banged on my door, demanding I vacate my own property. I informed them they were mistaken, and that this was my home. I showed them my deed. They accused me of forgery, and then those two men, I gestured with my chin towards the injured pair, forcibly broke down my door and entered my home. My dogs, who are professionally trained for personal protection, acted to defend me and my home from what was a clear and present threat. Once the threat was neutralized, I called them off and immediately dialed 911. The deputy's gaze flickered from me to the splintered door frame, then back. He saw the truth of the forced entry written in shattered wood. I provided him with my military ID, the original county-stamped deed to the property, and a folder containing Thor's and Loki's training certifications and complete, up-to-date vaccination records. "They're not pets, officer," I explained. "They're certified protection K9s. They did exactly what they were trained to do." The deputies took statements from everyone. Carol's was a rambling, incoherent narrative of victimization, casting me as a violent drifter, and her as a brave community leader protecting her flock. Chad and Gary's stories were shorter but equally mendacious, claiming they'd knocked politely and I'd sicked the dogs on them without provocation. The physical evidence, however, was stubborn. The broken door frame screamed forced entry. The paramedics confirmed Chad's bite wounds were deep but clean, and Gary's ankle was a sprain, likely from the fall. They were transported to the local hospital for treatment, but the deputies made it clear they were not under arrest yet. They left me with a case number and a grim warning that this was far from over. I knew they were right. I spent the rest of the night boarding up my splintered door, the silence of the woods feeling more menacing than peaceful. The war had begun. It didn't take long for Carol to launch her main offensive. Within 48 hours, I was served with a barrage of legal documents. It was a classic bully litigation strategy, designed to crush an opponent under the weight of legal fees and stress. The HOA was suing me for damages for the injuries to Chad, who was, predictably, Carol's nephew on Gary. They filed an emergency motion to have Thor and Loki declared vicious animals and impounded for euthanasia. And, most audaciously, they filed for an immediate injunction to have me evicted from my own home, attaching a brightly colored, professional-looking map that showed my lot, Lot 14, as a common area belonging to Whispering Pines Estates. Reading the documents, I felt a cold, familiar calm settle over me. This was just another battlefield, another complex problem requiring a systematic solution. My first call was to David Chen, a lawyer a friend from my unit had recommended. David was a former JAG officer, sharp, cynical, and utterly allergic to nonsense. "So let me get this straight," he said over the phone after I explained the situation. "The HOA president and her mall cop rejects break into your house. Your trained dogs defend you, and now they're suing you and trying to kill your dogs? Oh, this is rich. This is the kind of case I get out of bed for." While David prepared to counter their legal onslaught, I started my own investigation. My engineering background taught me one thing: every structure, physical or legal, rests on a foundation. I was going to excavate the foundation of Carol's entire claim. I drove to the county records office, a musty old building downtown filled with the scent of aging paper. For 3 days, I became a fixture in their archives. I pulled every deed, every plat map, every zoning ordinance, and every survey related to the land around Whisper Lake, going back to the turn of the 20th century. I built a timeline, a precise, documented history of the land. My grandfather's property was, as he'd always said, carved out and sold in 1942, a single parcel with clearly defined riparian rights to the lake. The Whispering Pines subdivision wasn't even conceived until the late 1980s. The developers had bought the surrounding farmland, but Lot 14 was a stubborn little island they could never acquire. I found the original development plans submitted to the county. My cabin was clearly marked as Existing private residence, not included. The HOA's claim was built on a lie, and their glossy map was a work of pure fiction. But I needed more. I needed to prove not just that they were wrong, but that they knew they were wrong. The real breakthrough came on the third day. Buried deep in the public record of HOA filings, I found a box of archived board meeting minutes from the last decade. It was tedious reading, page after page of complaints about unapproved garden gnomes and the wrong shade of beige shutters. But then, I found it, the smoking gun. It was in the minutes from a board meeting held 5 years prior, chaired by none other than Carol Miller. The agenda item was innocuously labeled Lot 14, Nuisance Abatement, but the notes were damning. Carol was quoted directly. "Since direct acquisition has proven fruitless, I propose a new, multi-pronged strategy. We will begin by commissioning a new community map that officially incorporates Lot 14 as common property. We will then engage in a campaign of strategic encumbrance and legal harassment, targeting any occupant. The goal is to make ownership so financially and emotionally draining that the owner will be forced to sell to the association at a discounted price." It was all there, in black and white. A premeditated, board-approved conspiracy to steal my family's land through malicious prosecution. I carefully photographed every page with my phone. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was a criminal enterprise. And I had the blueprint. I left the records office that day not with the grim determination of a man defending himself, but with the cold, precise focus of a hunter. The legal storm Carol had unleashed quickly turned into a tempest of her own making. As David filed our massive countersuit, news of the incident at the old cabin began to ripple through the meticulously manicured cul-de-sacs of Whispering Pines. The official narrative, spun by Carol in frantic emails to the residents, was one of a heroic stand against a dangerous vagrant, but some people weren't buying it. My first unexpected ally emerged from the heart of the community, Carol ruled. Her name was Margaret, a retired librarian in her late 70s with sharp eyes and a spine of steel. She called me, her number passed along by a sympathetic deputy. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "My name is Margaret Atherton. I was on the HOA board for 10 years. I quit 5 years ago because of Carol Miller and her obsession with your grandfather's cabin. We met for coffee in a neutral town nearby. Margaret was a walking archive of the HOA's dirty laundry. She confirmed that Carol's crusade to acquire the cabin was legendary. She called it the blemish." Margaret explained, stirring her tea. She hated that this authentic, rustic piece of history stood in defiance of her plastic, beige utopia. She tried to get your grandfather to sell a dozen times. When he politely refused, she took it as a personal insult. Margaret had been on the board when Carol first proposed her strategy of strategic encumbrance. Margaret had vehemently opposed it, calling it unethical and illegal. For her troubles, Carol orchestrated a campaign to have her removed from the board, labeling her as an obstacle to progress. Margaret had kept records. She went home and returned with a binder full of old emails and internal memos, all of which corroborated the official meeting minutes I had found. She was providing the color and context to my black and white evidence. David, my lawyer, was practically giddy when I presented him with my findings and Margaret's documents. "Alex, this is beautiful," he said, spreading the papers across his conference table. "This isn't just a countersuit for trespass anymore. This is a fortress." He immediately refiled our case, and it was a masterpiece of legal aggression. We sued not only the HOA as an entity, but every board member individually, including Carol, for trespass, conspiracy, malicious prosecution, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But David added a masterstroke, a civil RICO claim. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act is typically used against organized crime, but David argued that the HOA, under Carol's leadership, was operating as a criminal enterprise. He cited a pattern of racketeering activity, specifically the conspiracy to acquire my land through extortion and fraudulent means. The RICO charge was a tactical nuke. It meant triple damages if we won, and it got the attention of federal authorities. More importantly, It terrified the HOA's insurance company. The depositions were the turning point where the first cracks in Carol's empire began to show. I went first. I sat for 6 hours, answering every question calmly and factually. I presented my timeline, my deeds, my maps, and my photos of the splintered door. I spoke about Thor and Loki's training, my military service, and my simple desire for a quiet life. I was unflappable. Then came Carol. She walked into the deposition room dressed in a power suit, radiating an aura of bored condescension. But her composure quickly crumbled under David's relentless, surgical questioning. When he presented her with the HOA meeting minutes, the smoking gun detailing her planche blanched. I've never seen that document before, she stammered. It's a fake. It's a complete forgery. David just smiled faintly. Ms. Miller, you are under oath. Is it your sworn testimony that these official, publicly filed minutes are a fabrication? Yes, she snapped, her voice rising. She pointed a finger at me, obviously created it to slander me. She had just committed perjury, and we had her cold. Next were the goons, Chad and Gary. Away from Carol's intimidating presence, their bravado evaporated. Gary, the one with the sprained ankle, was a nervous wreck. He admitted they weren't licensed or bonded as security officers. He confessed that Carol had told them to do what was necessary to secure the property. But it was Chad, the nephew, who cracked completely. David played on his youth and his obvious fear of real legal trouble. Chad, David said softly, were you offered any incentive to handle the situation at the cabin? Chad looked at his lawyer, who gave a slight nod. He crumpled. Aunt Carol, she said she'd give me a $2,000 bonus if we got the squatter out that night. He mumbled, his eyes on the floor. She told us to open the door and get him out. She said the cabin was ours. The confession hung in the air, a fatal blow to Carol's entire case. The conspiracy was no longer an allegation. It was a confessed fact. The final nail in the coffin arrived a week later via courier. It was a formal reservation of rights letter from the HOA's errors and omissions insurance carrier. In cold, unambiguous language, the letter stated that their policy did not cover claims arising from intentional, malicious, fraudulent, or criminal acts committed by the board of directors. The insurance company was washing its hands of the entire mess. Suddenly, Carol and every single member of her board were personally, individually on the hook for the massive financial liability of our multi-million-dollar RICO lawsuit. The walls weren't just closing in on Carol, they were about to collapse. The letter from the insurance carrier landed on the desks of the HOA board members like a grenade with the pin pulled. The realization that their personal assets, their homes, their retirement accounts, their meticulously curated suburban lives were now collateral damage in Carol's personal war sent a shockwave of panic through Whispering Pines. The phones started ringing. Frantic, terrified calls between board members, their sycophantic loyalty to Carol evaporating in the face of potential financial ruin. They did the only thing they could. They called an emergency HOA meeting. It was ostensibly, for all residents, a desperate attempt to control the narrative and rally support. Carol, ever the narcissist, saw it as her stage. She planned to deliver the performance of a lifetime, to paint herself as the martyred protector of community values, and me as the litigious, dangerous interloper with attack dogs. She wildly underestimated the power of self-preservation. I knew this meeting was the main event. It was the showdown, the moment to bring everything into the light. David, Margaret, and I huddled in my now-repaired cabin to plan our strategy. We don't need to be aggressive, David advised, pacing in front of the stone fireplace. We just need to be factual, let the evidence speak, let them be the emotional ones. Margaret agreed. These people have been living under Carol's thumb for years, she said. They're tired of being fined because their mailbox is an inch too low. They just need a reason and the permission to stand up to her. The fact that she might bankrupt them is a very, very good reason. My role was simple. Stay calm, present the facts like I was briefing a general, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed to the gills. It had the tense, charged atmosphere of a political rally on the brink of a riot. The air was thick with anxiety and gossip. I walked in with David at my side, Margaret following a few steps behind. My presence caused a hush to fall over the room. People stared, some with open hostility, others with a nervous curiosity. We took seats in the front row, a deliberately provocative move. Thor and Loki were safely back at the cabin, but their presence was felt in the narrative Carol was about to spin. Carol took the podium, dressed in a somber navy blue suit, her face arranged in an expression of pained solemnity. She started with a tearful account of the horrific night, her voice trembling as she described the unprovoked, vicious attack by my beasts. She spoke of her sworn duty to protect the community's property values and the safety of its residents from outside threats. It was a masterful performance of victimhood, and for a moment, I could see some of the residents nodding along, caught in her emotional web. Then, she turned her attention to the lawsuit, dismissing it as a frivolous, greedy money grab by an opportunist trying to extort the community. "He is trying to take your HOA dues," she warned, her voice rising, "to line his own pockets." Finally, the board president, a nervous-looking man named Bill, reluctantly gave me the floor. "The board will now allow Mr. Davies a few moments to speak," he said, avoiding my eyes. I walked to the podium, not with a stack of papers, but with a simple USB drive. I plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector, and the screen behind me flickered to life. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and even, carrying easily through the silent room. "My name is Alex Davies. I don't want your HOA dues. I just want to be left alone, in my own home. There's been a lot of talk about who owns what, so let's start with some facts." On the screen, I projected the official county plat map from 1942. I used a laser pointer to trace the clean, undeniable lines of Lot 14. "This is my property," I said simply, "as recorded by this county 45 years before Whispering Pines existed." Then, I switched the image. Beside the old map, I projected the HOA's colorful, fraudulent map. "And this," I said, pointing to the spot where my cabin had been absorbed into a green blob labeled, "Oh, Common Area," "is a work of fiction." Gasps rippled through the audience. I didn't stop there. "I've been accused of slandering Ms. Miller. So, let's hear from her own nephew, shall we?" I played a 30-second audio clip from Chad's deposition. His nervous, mumbling voice filled the room. "She said she'd give me a $2,000 bonus if we got the squatter out that night. She told us to open the door and get him out." The mood in the room shifted instantly from suspicion to shock. The whispers started, angry and sharp. I then projected the image of the HOA meeting minutes from 5 years ago, highlighting the passage where Carol laid out her plan for strategic encumbrance and legal harassment. I read it aloud, slowly and clearly. The residents were now staring at Carol, their faces masks of disbelief and dawning fury. People who had been fined hundreds of dollars for trivial infractions were realizing the entire system was built on the whims of a vindictive president. For the finale, I projected the crisp, cold text of the reservation of rights letter from the insurance company. "And finally," I said, "this is a letter from your HOA's insurance carrier. It was sent to every board member. It states in no uncertain terms that due to what they call intentional, malicious, and criminal acts, they will not be covering any of the damages from my lawsuit. That means," I paused, letting the weight of my next words sink in, "that every dollar of any judgment against the HOA will be paid directly by the board members themselves, not by the insurance company. Not from HOA dues, but from their personal bank accounts." All hell broke loose. The room exploded. It wasn't a riot. It was an insurrection. Residents were on their feet, screaming at the board. "You lied to us," one man yelled at Carol. "You used our money to fund your personal vendetta," another woman shrieked. The other board members looked like they were about to be physically ill. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at Carol, the architect of their ruin. Bill, the board president, grabbed the microphone. "That's not we didn't," he stammered, but it was too late. Margaret stood up, her voice cutting through the din with the authority of a seasoned librarian. "I believe this community has heard enough from Miss Miller. I would like to make a formal motion for the immediate removal of Carol Miller as president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association for cause. A board member, a man who looked like his entire net worth was flashing before his eyes, seconded the motion so fast it was almost a single word. Bill, looking defeated, called for the vote. The roar of "A" was deafening. It was a tidal wave of anger and betrayal, washing away years of petty tyranny in a single, unified shout. Carol Miller stood at the podium, her face ashen, her mouth slightly agape. Stripped of her power, publicly humiliated, and facing financial ruin, she simply turned and walked out of the room, the boos and jeers of her former subjects following her out the door. The Queen had been deposed. The fall of Carol Miller was swift and total. Her walk of shame from the community center was the end of her reign. Within a week, a for sale sign was staked into the pristine lawn in front of her oversized beige house. She and her husband packed up their white Lexus and disappeared, becoming the very thing she'd always feared, an afterthought. The legal system, though slow, began to grind forward with grim efficiency. Chad and Gary, the bargain bin security team, were charged with misdemeanor breaking and entering and criminal trespass. They both pleaded guilty, receiving probation and a hefty fine, their careers as amateur enforcers over before they began. The most satisfying development was the news that the county district attorney, prompted by the evidence from my civil suit, had opened a criminal investigation into Carol herself. She was eventually charged with solicitation to commit a crime and conspiracy. The wheels of justice were turning, and they were rolling right over her carefully constructed life. The new HOA board, now headed by the sensible and formidable Margaret, was in a state of sheer panic over my lawsuit. Their first official act was to have their lawyer call David with an offer of surrender. The negotiations were short. There was no haggling. They agreed to every single one of our demands. They paid for a master carpenter to custom build and install a new, solid mahogany door for my cabin, far stronger than the original. They paid for repairs to the interior wall and the refinishing of the floor where the goons had scuffed it. They paid every cent of David's legal fees, which were substantial, and they wrote me a check. A large six-figure check for damages, personal distress, and punitive action that made my eyes water. It wasn't about the money, but it was a tangible, undeniable admission of their wrongdoing. As part of the settlement, they were also required to file a newly surveyed plat map with the county, one that officially and permanently recorded my property's independence and its deeded riparian rights. Furthermore, they had to publish a formal public apology to me in the community newsletter, acknowledging their grievous errors in judgment and the unwarranted harassment I had endured. The RICO suit, the nuclear option, was dropped as part of this comprehensive settlement. Its purpose had been served. It was the hammer that brought the whole corrupt structure crashing down. The changes in Whispering Pines were profound. Margaret, as the new president, led a complete overhaul of the covenants. Dozens of Carol's most absurd and petty rules, the ones governing mailbox height, holiday decoration timelines, and approved shades of lawn furniture, were ceremoniously struck from the books. The atmosphere of the neighborhood began to change from one of oppressive conformity to one of relaxed community. People started talking to their neighbors again, not to report on them, but to get to know them. My little cabin, once the blemish, became something of a local landmark. Some residents would wave as they took their boats out on the lake. Others would nod respectfully when I saw them in town. I was the quiet man who had stood up to the bully and won. I used a portion of the settlement money to do what I had always planned, properly restore my grandfather's cabin. I reinforced the foundations, put on a new roof, and installed a discreet, state-of-the-art security system. The peace I had come for finally felt real, earned not on a foreign battlefield, but right here, on my own front porch. On a cool autumn evening, about a year after that chaotic first night, I sat on my porch swing, watching the sunset paint the lake with fire. Thor was snoozing at my feet, and Loki was watching a squirrel with lazy intensity. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It was a grim, quiet sort of victory. Carol, in her arrogance, had seen my desire for a quiet life as a weakness she could exploit. She couldn't comprehend that a combat engineer approaches every problem, whether it's a hostile fortification or a hostile HOA, with the same methodical patience and overwhelming strategic force. She started a war based on ego and entitlement, and I had ended it with deeds, documents, and depositions. She had brought a mob to a battle of wits, and she'd come completely unarmed. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, I patted Thor's head. My peace had been shattered, but I had rebuilt it, stronger and more secure than before. And I had learned that sometimes the best guardians of a quiet life are a good lawyer, a solid set of facts, and a couple of very, very good dogs.